Well, it's wonderful to be here, and I've got a mic on so I don't have to yell, which is great. But if there's any issue hearing me, just let me know. So what I want to do is share with you some work that we've been doing over the years, but a lot of this also comes from our personal experience. And so I want to start by telling you a story. So about 12 years ago, Linda Babcock, one of my colleagues, sent the rest of us an email saying that her work life was out of control. She was being asked to do tasks that were not core to her job, but she had a hard time saying no. And she reached out to the rest of us because we were all successful in our careers, and she figured that we probably had the same problem. So she sent us in the initial email, she called us the I Just Can't Say No Club. And because she knew we would say yes, she sent us a doodle post saying, when can we meet? Now, none of us knew each other, but we all knew that, well, why not? This seems like an interesting group of women to get to know. And so we started meeting. We met regularly at a local restaurant, Union Grill. I know we have Sunday here who has been one of my former students at Carnegie Mellon. So glad to see your smiling face here. And Union Grill. So it's a nice little pub. We got a couple of bottles of wine and we would meet regularly and we talk about our struggles and our work. And over the years, we got better at saying no. But what we realized pretty quickly is that it didn't fix the problem. While we were running around from meeting to meeting, our male colleagues didn't seem to face the same challenges. And they had these uninterrupted blocks of time. We had, very full schedules. But every time we said no to one of these tasks, another woman just ended up having to do it. Oh. So we figured, we wanted, is this our problem? Is this something we're doing wrong? Or is there a bigger dynamic going on here? So as research faculties, we decided we really wanted to try to understand what was going on. So we looked at the literature and we did some of our own work and we talked to a lot of women in organizations and really feel like we identified the root cause of the problem and are able to come up with some really useful solutions. So that's what I'm here to share with you today. Okay, so the first thing we needed to do is identify the type of work that we're talking about. So what we decided to call it was non-promotable tasks. So a non-promotable task is exactly what it sounds like. It's a type of task we do that's important for the organization, but doesn't advance your own career. So let's take a moment and let you think about the things you do that might fall under this umbrella. And if anyone's willing to share an example. Sunday.
When I was a financial advisor, a new financial advisor, I was asked to manage the United Way campaign for the whole office for a whole month.
Okay, that is
rocked it, but it was a non-promotable task.
Right. And everyone was appreciative,
yeah,
but it didn't matter for your own career. That's a great example. Yeah.
Office celebrations and
birthday parties,
retirement
parties, maybe even baby showers or whatever. So planning those events. What else are you doing? Yeah.
Keeping the break room clean.
Office housework. Keeping the break room clean. What else? Any other examples? We do them all the time. I know we have faculty in the room. What's the biggest category that we do as faculty? We sit on oversight committees. committees, right? So there's a lot of things we do. And what we wanted to do is start developing a list of what are typical non-promotable tasks. So we came up with our top 10 list. So here, we can look at these in terms of kind of clusters of different types of non-promotable tasks. So the first few focus on the things we do to help our colleagues, right? So we may fill in if someone else needs help, if they're going to be absent. We may coordinate other people's work, right? Or put the slide deck together, clean it up, collate the report, proofread, and help other people in their reports and so on. So things we do to help each other out professionally. The next category of work are things we do that helps our organization most directly, right? So these are those committees that we serve on, right? In terms of oversight, or it might be the process improvement committee that you sit on. Logistical planning in special events. So the baby showers, it could be, but it could be an offsite. team development, right? All these other things we do. So they could be professional, they could be more personal. We participate in recruiting new colleagues, right? We might go out to recruiting dinners or sit on recruiting committees or onboard new hires and train them and mentor them, right? So all these things we do really is in service of the organization function. We often manage the socio-emotional connections. We may be the shoulder that people come in to get help with their personal problems or even resolve conflict. And finally, that last category of office housework is what you've probably read about in the popular press. People have used that term. And it's been around for a while, but it refers to all the things we do that are kind of maintenance tasks. So cleaning the break room, getting coffee, ordering lunch, all of those things are non-promotable. People appreciate it. It's important. These things need to get done, but they're often not part of your job. So if you're in HR, recruiting and onboarding may be part of your job. Then it would be promotable. But for other people, less so. So as a faculty member, right, so I'm going to use it, since we're sitting in a institution of higher learning, I'll use that as an example. So as a university professor, I sit on a lot of committees. And over the 35 years I've been at Carnegie Mellon, I've sat on 3 building committees. I was on the committee that designed the new wing of the new business school. I was on the committee that designed the new floor of the new wing of the business school when we ran out of space. And then I was on the committee that designed the new building when we outgrew that building and had a nice donor that supported the new space. There's nothing special about me and my expertise that says I should be the faculty member representative on that committee, but this is something I did over and over again. I study team conflict and negotiation. That's my research area and teaching area. So you can imagine, I often am turned to resolve conflict, and I imagine some of my colleagues here may, experience the same thing. So you get a sense of these things. Now, we could keep lists, but what we really need to do to help other people is figure out what are the core characteristics that make a task more or less promotable. So what we did is boiled it down to some core characteristics, 3 that I want to first share with you. First has to do with the instrumentality of the task to the organization's bottom line or mission, depending on what type of organization you work for, right? So if you work for a profit organization, how directly do your activities contribute to generating revenue or reducing costs, right? If you work for a mission-driven organization or a nonprofit, like a university, right? So what's the mission of a university? It's often to generate and disseminate new knowledge, especially for research-based institutions like the one I'm at, and University of Washington as well, right? So the things faculty do in service of advancing the generation and disseminating of knowledge, is more promotable for me, my research and my teaching. Serving on the building committee, less so. The second is visibility. All right, so can people see the fruits of your labor? 2 aspects that influence that primarily. One is your effort combined in with other people, then it'd be more hidden, or are you behind the scenes, or are you up front, right? And so you can think about, when you're working on a team as an example, you may be the person up front who is presenting, who's getting credit for the work, or you may be the person in the background collating the slide deck, doing the background research. And assuming your positions are similar, there's often this types of differentiation. The second is whether the organization tracks the work, right? So you may do it and it may be visible in terms of they know you did the effort, but if the organization doesn't keep track of that in any way, then it becomes more invisible. And then the third characteristic is, does the task require the specialized skills that you were hired to perform? Okay, or can just about anyone do it? And I'll go back to my example of being on the building committee. I didn't have any specialized skills about designing buildings. I was not an architect. I wasn't a designer. I had some knowledge about academia and what professors needed, but so did all my colleagues, right? So that wasn't specific to my expertise. Okay, so if you look at all 3 of these dimensions and think about those tasks that we talked about, or anything that you do in the course of your workday, and sometimes outside, the higher these are, the more likely the task is to be promotable. The lower they are, the less likely. So clearly we can think about promotability on a continuum from low to high. It's not an on-off switch, although I'm going to talk about it that way today just for ease of discussion. Okay, I'll use the term promotable, non-promotable. Before I move away from this slide, though, we need to acknowledge tasks that are indirectly promotable. That is, they may not help you today in your current job, but they might help you tomorrow. So these are the things in this we talk about in terms of developing our networks, right? And relationships, or developing skill sets like leadership skills that we may not be in a leadership position today, but it's something that we can leverage later on. Now, we suggest you beware about these tasks because they have diminishing returns. That is, the first time you're on that building committee, you make the connections, you meet people, or you run the United Way campaign. You meet people across campus, right? The second time, you've already developed those connections. So less so. The third time, even less so. So again, there are diminishing returns with these tasks. So you need to be careful that once you've derived the benefit from that non-promotable task, let someone else benefit from it and move on to do, to think about what's next for you. Okay, so our next question then was, well, do women do more of this work than men? Or was it just our experience? So here we went to the literature to say, well, have people studied this? They didn't call it non-promotable tasks, but they've studied the opportunities and the type of work that people are assigned based on gender. And I like this one study to talk about because they broke down women by different ethnicities and races. They only reported data on white men, so I don't have additional data on men of different ethnicities. And these were 3,000 engineers. It was a survey done by the Center for Work-Life Law with the Society of Women Engineers. And they asked a survey, and they had several questions that were very relevant to what we're interested in. So they asked people to compare themselves to colleagues of comparable role or seniority or experience. And two of the questions they asked had to do with promotable tasks, right? Do you have access to desirable assignments or high profile tasks or work teams? And what they found is that the white men reported having more access to these things than the women. And that especially in that second category of desirable assignments, the women of color had less access even than the white women. So there was something going on here. They also asked a question about non-promotable work in terms of office housework. And they defined it as finding a time everyone can have a meeting, for example, taking notes, planning office parties, and so on. And they found a very large difference between the men and the women, regardless of their race, that the women were reporting, doing more than twice as much. Okay, so this was interesting. And we found evidence of this in other industries as well, other professions like high-tech workers, accounting, law, consulting, which I'm going to show you more data on, and so on. But we also found evidence for it in studies of grocery store clerks and TSA agents. Okay, so not the professions per se. So we were seeing this all over the place, even before we started doing our own research. And most of this research, though, it is based on self-report data. So people are filling out surveys and they're telling them about their own impressions. But we know that this type of data can be subject to bias, recall issues. Maybe not by gender, but there's this issue. So we decided, well, can we get some objective data to see if we can identify this difference in real time? And we were lucky that we were able to work with a professional services firm because what's unique about professional services firms? They track their time because they have to bill their clients. And so some organizations have their workers, track both their billable time and their non-billable time. And this organization was really detailed in their tracking. So they had tracking of their client projects and their time on client projects, but also tracked their pro bono work, their community service, mentoring, and so on. So the organization was able to go in and we could flag how much time they were spending on promotable and non-promotable work. Okay. The other thing I'm going to show you is the difference between that and men versus women, but also in terms of junior versus senior consultants, because you'd expect that as you get more senior in the organization, you become a partner, whatever it looks like in that firm, that it might be different. Okay, so what we found actually surprised the organization and it surprised us. What we found is that regardless of seniority, the women were spending, the median woman, so this was, we did means too, but the median woman was spending about 200 more hours per year on non-promotable tasks as compared to their male colleagues. Regardless of seniority, right? This gap remained. And this is 3 years of data that we were able to look at. That's a month of time being spent on doing work that does not advance your career. A month more, not a month total, right? So that was what the gap was. And of course, this time has to come from somewhere. So where does it come from? And here the story differed depending on whether we were looking at the junior consultants or the senior consultants. And some of you may be thinking, I know where this is going. Okay. Interestingly and frustratingly, the junior consultants were doing 250 fewer hours per year on their promotable work, the women, as compared to the men. Okay. So they seem to be making some sort of a trade-off. And we don't know why this happened. We don't know if they had fewer opportunities. We don't know if they their non-promotable work pushed out or crowded out the promotable work. We don't know why this happened, but we saw this across the 3 years. The story is different for the senior women. They just worked an extra month of time. Okay. And this is probably why they were still with the firm, right? They knew that they couldn't cut back on their promotable work. They needed to deliver, but they still needed to get the non-promotable work done. So this, of course, pushed into their nights and weekends and so on. So they worked that, they had more of an excessive load. Now, when you put this together, the inequity of the situation is pretty clear, right? But it doesn't stop there because, of course, this has an impact. It has an impact on the women, and has an impact on their careers, and then it has an impact on our organizations. So first, I want to talk about this issue of work-work imbalance. So this is when your promotable and your non-promotable work are out of balance in comparison to your peers, right? Everybody does some, and you don't expect it to be equal between the two. Is the balance equivalent to what other people are doing, or are you doing more of one relative to the other in comparison to others? Okay, and if you think about this, right, there's one primary outcome, which is probably not surprising, which is career stagnation, right? If you have less opportunities to demonstrate your value add to the organization, and you're being kind of pigeonholed into doing non-promotable work, it's going to harm you when you're being considered for advancement or raises or other high-profile assignments and so on, right? And that, in addition to slowing down careers and perhaps leading to turnover, also can result in a loss of confidence. So this is actually what happened to Linda, my co-author, at one point when we were meeting. She was spending so much time doing non-promotable work that her research was suffering. She didn't have time to do it. She was having a hard time attracting students into her lab. And she really questioned whether she should even just shut down the lab altogether and give up on her research initiative. A loss of confidence in herself. There's also interesting studies of undergraduates in engineering, women versus men, and how women were reporting that they were being assigned tasks that were more behind the scenes, less challenging than within their teams. So this was not from professors, but this was how the work kind of doled out within their work groups. And they were really questioning whether engineering was even the right career for them. And more women were opting out of pursuing an engineering career as a result. All right. And these are all examples of dissatisfaction and turnover. People leave, people are just dissatisfied with their work. And, you know, that's very disruptive for a career and very difficult. The other negative outcome that women experience is work overload. We all experience work overload, men and women, of course, but when women are being overloaded with non-promotable tasks, of course, the time spills over into your work-family balance, right? Or work personal time, the time we spend to regenerate and rejuvenate, spend with people that we love. So that harms individuals in terms of balance. It's very stressful, right? It can lead to burnout. We know work overload in general leads to burnout across the board, has negative health outcomes as well. And this was what happened to Lisa. She was working such crazy long hours that she was cutting in the time on weekends to be with her kids who were pretty young. And she was experiencing very high levels of stress, both physical and emotional, that she had to work through. And finally, what happens as a result of burnout, almost by definition, is people withdraw. They put boundaries and limit their time, right? And this, we've been reading a lot about quiet quitting, at least we were last year more so, and all the churn and people changing jobs and thinking about career choices. And we really believe that this is contributing to that, at least for women, is that if you think about quiet quitting, there's lots of definitions of it, but people typically talk about it as workers saying, I'm only going to do this much of my job and then I'm done. I'm setting boundaries. And the setting of boundaries is often I'll do the work that's promotable and I'm not doing anything else, right? So it does have implications for people completing non-promotable work. And that may be a rational thing to do, but it's from the organization's perspective, it's problematic because again, this work needs to get done. So what do we do? So thinking about the organizations, this overburdening women with non-promotable tasks is also problematic for them. It's not just harmful to women in their careers, but it's problematic for organizations because it's a very inefficient and ineffective use of the talent pool, right? So think about it. If you're delegating work based on gender rather than on skills and abilities, it's very inefficient, right? Because we're not leveraging the skill sets of a portion of our workforce, and that's problematic. So, from there's a business case here, lost performance and productivity as a result, but there's also this culture of inequity that develops where there are the haves and the have-nots, or the people who have to do this work and the people who don't have to do this work to the same extent. And that can lead to resentment and other people potentially even pulling back from contributing to the organization. And then people leave. And we know turnover is incredibly costly for organizations, especially when they're trying to improve their representation of women, and yet they're engaging in these practices that undermine that goal. All right. So we wanted to say, well, why is this happening? We want to fix the problem. But to fix the problem, we can just kind of keep throwing Jell-O at the wall and see what sticks. But it's better to really figure out what the root cause is first, and we can target our corrections. So we started thinking about, well, why do women end up doing this work? And we came up with kind of 3 possible mechanisms, kind of at the micro level and the decision-making level. So one is, it's possible that women are asked more often than men, and that's why women end up doing more of this work. So that's one possible dynamic. Another is that maybe we say yes more, like where everyone's asked the same amount, but women we just can't say no. Right? But the men are better at doing that. So that's a possibility. We say yes more often, or maybe we volunteer. Like when someone asks for someone to take the notes at the meeting or clean up after, or lead the United Way campaign, we're the first ones to raise our hands. So all of these things are possibilities, and we wanted to tease them apart to see what was going on. So we ran a study. I think this one is.
Here's a new one.
No, I had one.
This was yours.
Okay. Sorry. Let me have a sip of water. There's way too many bottles here. Thank you. So we designed a set of studies to test these different explanations that mirrored a type of situation that we've probably all been in, where you're in a meeting, somebody has to take notes or take minutes and write the report up after the meeting and distribute the notes. And nobody really wants to do it. So what happens? What do you do when the call comes? Oh, you pull out your phone, eyes go down. We're looking through our notes. If we're on a Zoom call, all of a sudden something grabs our attention off camera, or maybe our camera accidentally gets turned off. I don't know. But You know, we all are trying to avoid this, but eventually somebody says, okay, I'll do it. And then we're able to move on, right? So that's the type of situation we were trying to model in our experimental paradigm. And the benefits of using an experiment is that we can control things and really isolate what's going on. All right, so we set up a situation where we brought in a group of people, men and women, mixed groups of gender, and they had to perform a task in groups of 3 that somebody had to volunteer to do before time ran out. And if no one volunteered, nobody got paid. If one person volunteered before time ran out, everyone got paid, but the person who volunteered to do the task got paid less.
Oh.
Right, because you have to do the work. It's costly to the individual to do the work, right? Okay, so that, you know, and that's to mirror kind of the incentives of what's going on in the situation. So we ran this over multiple trials with different compositions of group, but all mixed gender. And what we found is that the women were 50% more likely to be the one to volunteer than a man. Okay, so about 50% more likely. So there's some evidence that holding everything else constant, gender was influencing this volunteering rate. I'm like, well, why is that happening? Why are women the ones who's volunteering to do it? So there's like a couple possible explanations. So one is there's something about women. We're more altruistic, we're more cooperative, we're the helpers, right? Maybe we like doing non-promotable tasks more. Whatever it is, there's something about us that says we're going to be the ones to raise our hands first and volunteer to do the task. Another is that maybe there's just these shared norms and expectations that we know that, like, if we don't do it, who will? So, okay, you know, we kind of give in first. So we wanted to try and tease these 2 explanations apart. And we did it by running same gender groups. So groups of all men or groups of all women. So if it's something about women versus men, then you would expect this difference to continue, right? The women are going to be volunteering. The men, you're going to have more situations where no one volunteers, or, you know, so they'll be volunteering less often. But that's not what we found. Okay. What we found is that in the all male groups, the men increased their rate of volunteering to about 1/3 of the time. Remember, these are groups of 3. So what did they do? We looked around the room, saw, oh, there's no women here. I need to step up and volunteer more often, right? Take my turn. The women engaged in the same calculus. They looked around the room, saw there were no men in the room, and they said, okay, I can just take my turn. I don't have to overcompensate. And they lowered their rate of volunteering to the point that it was at the same level. Okay, so now they were both volunteering about 1/3 of the time. Okay. So that was interesting. And because this was happening, we also, by the way, measured for individual differences. So we looked at people's level of altruism and cooperative orientation and anything else we could come up with that might explain the difference, and we controlled for it, and the difference remained. Okay, so it wasn't anything that was like gender personality. Okay, so then our next question, so what we could deduce from this is that this is really driven by shared norms and expectations of who's going to volunteer, right? And men and women hold these norms, and it affects both our behaviors. Okay. So we wondered whether these norms and expectations would generalize to situations of who gets asked, right? So if this is kind of a shared, whether it's conscious or subconscious, if we all share these norms, then it should influence who we ask to volunteer. So I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting where you've been voluntold to do something, yeah? Where someone says, oh, Laura, you took such great notes last time. I'm sure you'd be happy to do it again. Would you be able to do it again? And so you have to respond yes or no. Okay, so that's the type of situation. So we added a 4th person to the group. We called them the manager, and they had to ask someone in the group to volunteer. We were back to our mixed gender groups. So they could choose between the men or the women. And what we found is that the women were asked about 44% more often than the men. So there was this going on. And what's really important about this finding is that it didn't matter what the gender of the manager was. Both male and female managers asked the women more often to the same degree. Okay, so again, shared norms. We all share these norms. And by the way, it's a pretty effective strategy because the women were 50% more likely to say yes when they were asked. So women said yes 75% of the time they were asked, and the men only said yes 50% of the time. Okay, so when we put this all together, it became clear to us that actually women end up doing more non-promotable tasks for all three of these reasons. We're asked more, we say yes more often, we volunteer more, but it's all driven by this phenomena of shared norms and expectations. This gives us a sense of what's driving it. It's not that we're just so cooperative or helpful that we just have to learn how to say no. It's that we're responding to these shared norms and expectations in this dynamic. Yeah, so.
Do you explore at all people's perceptions of competence? So, there's and the degree to which people promote or profess a learned incompetence as a way to escape being voluntold. My general perception is through experience that is gendered.
Which part?
That the cultivation of learned incompetence, or at least perceived incompetence, is gendered.
All right. So are you talking about that strategic incompetence?
Strategic incompetence.
Yeah, okay. So this has come up. It comes up every time we talk, and we talk about it in the book. And yeah, so it's referred to sometimes as a weaponized incompetence or strategic incompetence. There was just an article that came across my feed yesterday on this. I have a wonderful article about it that I just shared yesterday with other people. Yes. So yeah, the answer is yes, that there is a gendered strategic incompetence issue, and so what that means is we kind of feign incompetence in order to get out of doing things you don't want to do. Oh, my handwriting is so bad, I can't take notes. Or you're assigned to lead a committee and you really flub it, so you don't get asked to do it again. Okay, when it's more of an effort issue than an ability issue. And there is evidence that men tend to do this more than women. But the reason is, again, it goes back to these shared, well, there's a lot of reasons why, but it's very tied into issues of expectations, norms, what it means to get ahead, success, perfectionism, lots of things. But there's an article that I'll forward to you, Zoe, that's written by a man who wrote a book before our book came out, talking about how to kind of be strategically incompetent to get ahead in your career. Like, don't do those other things and just do a bad job. So he wrote a book about this. And then he came across our work. And then he wrote an article. I think is that the one that's in Fortune? I think it's in Fortune. And he basically said, like, wait a minute, there's a problem here. And there's a lot of unintended consequences that I didn't even realize because of these findings. And he kind of rolled it back a little bit. So yeah, that's right. And it was a great article, and I'll share it. You can distribute it. Okay. All right. So, if we get out of the laboratory, and one other thing I want to tell you about this task that they did, we're talking about skills and abilities. And when you said competence, this is what I thought you were talking about. There were no skills associated with doing this task. The task was to push a button on your keyboard before time ran out. Okay. So it wasn't gendered tasks. There were no ability differences, right? But in the real world, tasks do differ. Some tasks are gendered. And so there's a lot of other dynamics that could be in play in organizations in terms of who ends up doing what. So, one reason we tend to ask women more than men is that we ask people we expect will say yes, right? So this goes back. If I know that a woman's more likely to say yes, it's a lot easier for me to go to the woman who says yes than it is for me to get 3 no's from men. Now, I'm living this right now because I am chair of faculty senate and I'm trying to get people on committees. And so the nice thing is that I know I'm not going to overrepresent the female faculty, so I'm making sure we get the right balance. But at the same time, people say no. And so, from a leadership perspective, it's a challenge. so we'll think about solutions. When I think about who's a good fit for NPTs, women might come to mind more easily, and that's the gendered issue, right? Is that many of these tasks are helping tasks, and we often think about women as being the helpers, people who toil behind the scenes. And so just cognitively, we may generate a list of female names in terms of that mental model we have. Another is that, of course, it's easier to ask someone who's done it before. So it, kind of is self-reinforcing. That first time I was on the building committee, I had to learn a lot about space and education and so on. But after that, I knew it. So it's just easier to put me on the committee than to put someone new on. All right. Sometimes we overtax women or we ask women because we need a female representative, right? So this is you've heard the term cultural taxation. This idea that you're asking someone not necessarily because of the skills they bring to the table, but because of the group that they represent, right? So in some organizations are proud of themselves that they have staffed all their committees with 50% women, except they only have 30% women in the firm. Right. So as a result, those 30% are on way too many committees. They're doing a lot more non-promotable tasks. And this is a much bigger problem for women of color, because you get tapped for your gender and you get tapped for your race. And you put those things together and it's double the work. Now, it's not to say if this is the right work to do, that you shouldn't be the ones to do it. There's some, like you're, whatever it is, if it's being in the compensation committee, that's really important work, or DEI work, it's really important work. We need to make space for women of color to do that work and free up other things so that they can do the work that's most important and that their lived experience is most important to represent. And then the last category, or I'm sure there's others, is benevolent sexism. So this idea that we're really just trying to help. I mean, women need extra leadership training. I want to help them. Or I really, you need to network more and meet more people. Well, there is a benefit to leadership training for everybody, men and women. There's also benefit to networking for everybody, men and women. But again, these are those indirectly promotable tasks that have diminishing returns. So when this work gets in the way of doing promotable work, it backfires, right? Because you're not giving the women the time to do the work that's actually going to advance their career. All right, so a lot going on there. So with this knowledge now, let's move to solutions. And I'm going to hit it in two levels. First, I'm going to talk about individual solutions, and I'm going to notice I'm focusing on balancing your workload as opposed to saying how to say no. Because part of this is saying yes and no to the right tasks, but the goal isn't to bring your NPTs down to zero. It's to bring it to the right level in comparison to your peers, not just your female peers, but all your colleagues, right? So this is a navigation issue. We need to fix the problem. I'm going to get to that, the root cause, but right now, we all need to be able to at least manage our own careers. So what can you do? We know women are more likely to say yes, and they're more likely to volunteer. So before you say yes or volunteer, take some time. It might engage in the 24-hour rule, where you can say no immediately, but you can't say yes immediately. Give yourself 24 hours to at least process the ask. All right. And then there's two aspects. Collect information, learn more about what you're being asked to do. And then the second row is going to be thinking about the personal implications for yourself, right? So the first row here is thinking about what information do you need? Who is asking you? And can you say no to that person, right? Is it your boss? Is it a colleague, a friend? Don't overestimate the cost of saying yes. Right, so we often underestimate. Oh, we can knock this one out, but things often take more effort than we think, and you don't want to feel kind of cornered. Sometimes people just knock at your door and throw an ask at you, and you feel like you just can't say no because it's immediate. But you can give yourself the time to respond, and then as you're thinking it through, we don't want to fall prey to some of these cognitive biases we have. Like, remember, we tend to discount the future. We don't think about ourselves in the future differently. So a good example of this is think about your calendar, right? Right now, your calendar for this week is probably pretty full. 3 weeks from now, it's more empty because you haven't filled it in yet. But you're going to be just as busy 3 weeks from now as you are now. So we have to think about, the future as we think about today. Beware of your triggers. Like, why do you feel the need to say yes? Is it something psychological about yourself? Is it guilt? I feel guilty saying no to someone. Is it fear? Fear that I'll be perceived negatively. I'm not seen as a team player. Or is it fear that you'll never be asked again? Right? If it's an opportunity you want to do, but you can't fit it in now. So what's driving that? And beware of the triggers and consider them in more depth rather than automatically saying yes. Another thing, we had these moments ourselves. We call them the diva moments. When we're asked to do a task that really felt good. I feel so good that my boss, my dean, asked me to provide my unique insight into this effort that he was working on. Or I was being asked to serve as associate editor in a journal. So great thing for a faculty member, but I had no time. And in the first case, actually in both, to be honest, I wasn't really interested in doing it, but I felt great being asked. We learn to enjoy the moment of being asked without necessarily feeling like you have to say yes. So enjoy the moment, but then think about the work. And then consider your implicit no. What are you giving up? Every time you say yes to something, you're implicitly saying no to something else. So what's getting crowded out? Is it your day, your regular work? Is it time with family? Lisa used to keep post-its on her, a post-it on her monitor with the names of her children. Now she knew the names of her children, but every time she was asked to do something that was short-term ask, non-promotable, maybe a extreme ask, she would think about her kids and say, look, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to have to do it this weekend. And that means I'm not going to be able to take the kids to the playground or do whatever I want to do with them. And so that helped her in thinking about her implicit no and remembering it. Now let's focus on, let's say you get to the point where you want to say no to this. Well, how do we say no and avoid negative repercussions? And I want to point out that this is more of an issue for women than men. Right? Because when a woman says no to a request, remember they're violating an expectation. When a man says no, it's kind of business as usual. All right, I'm overstating it, but it's not a violation, so it's okay. And in fact, there's some research that demonstrates that women get penalized for saying no, but men don't. Women also, but men get rewarded for saying yes, and women don't. Right, so there's this imbalance. This is work by Madeline Hallman. All right, so what can you do instead? So the first thing for women to avoid the negative repercussion is recognize that when someone's coming to you and asking for help or like that, they have a problem that needs to be solved. So sometimes we can just brush it off because we have no responsibility. But many times it's really, we want to think about offering some sort of a solution that solves their problem. Or are we out of time?
Getting close.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. I'm almost done. So we can do that with conditions on your yes, or turn a request for help into a negotiation. So find ways to help them solve their problem without taking it on yourself. Put conditions on your yes, right? So narrow the task down to something that's manageable, or negotiate. What can I let go? What will you help me let go of in order to take this on? So these are just some examples. But basically what we're talking about is a process of assessment and adjustment. What's the current situation? What do I want it to be? And how am I going to get there? And who's going to help me get there? Right. So again, it's about balancing that workload. Choose a workload that's right for you. Find the NPTs that are right for you. And for me, this was something I was doing naturally, but for others, it didn't always happen. So choose the NPTs that are the right ones for you. Okay, finally, I want to spend 2 minutes on the institutional solution. So of course, individuals can affect change through bottom-up efforts, creating awareness, talking about what are non-promotable tasks, who's doing what, and just getting this in the conversation before there's a problem. So just getting it into the lexicon, and thinking about and protecting, junior colleagues, interjecting when someone's being voluntold, and so on. But managers have they have a better possibility of creating impact because they have control over who gets asked to do non-promotable tasks within their work unit. So, instead of asking for volunteers, use other methods to distribute the work. Could be randomly or taking turns or assigning them strategically, redistributing the work that's already being done, and get more people involved in doing these tasks. So managers can do this because we have that authority. We can also educate our employees about what's promotable and what's not promotable and help themselves by balancing their workload. And of course, not overburdening members of underrepresented groups. Finally, organizations really have an important play to role if we look at the HR systems we have in place, right? So what expectations do we have for non-promotable tasks? What are the standards, the minimums, the maximum? How are we going to track that information? Good HR practice. Instead of these tasks being invisible, we're making them visible and setting expectations. And maybe provide some incentives to do them so more people are interested in doing them. Moving tasks around across jobs. So what's promotable for one job, what's non-promotable for one job becomes promotable for another. So make sure you're matching the work with the role. And then thinking about work that people are doing and making it promotable when it's currently non-promotable. And I love the best example of this is the DEI work we do, right? It's often non-promotable. But 70% of organizations say that work is very important to the effectiveness of their organization, but only about 30% of organizations actually track and reward it. So there's an opportunity, right, to do that. So with that, we'll definitely result in better workplaces, but also be able to retain and attract the talent that we're all looking for. So with that, thank you. And yes, so I know we have to, I'm sorry, I didn't realize how long I was talking, but I can take some questions now if there's time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been so powerful. So I'm sitting right next to a DEI trainer over here. And so I'm a P20 educator. And I know that we have moved out of the term norms just because of how it just, it's top down, it's fight, it's all of that. And we have embraced agreements. And I see so much of I'm not in the business sphere, my husband is, but just realizing as equity is being discussed in all of our required DEI trainings, that this would be part of the discussion in equity and realizing what we could do when we take this lens of equity onto this discussion and talking about co-creating agreements, right? Of how we talk about these two aspects of what is promotable and what isn't, and just breaching that discussion, right? Just going there and planting seeds, right?
And I love the term agreements because what you're doing is taking the invisible and making them visible.
Totally.
So I really like that phrasing. So while we're doing that, I know you also you have books to hand out.
I do.
So,
while folks are asking questions, I was just going to ask, if you're in the room and you're a student, can you raise your hand? And we're going to, we have books here to distribute, but we're going to start with students and then go from there. So keep your hand up while we're.
Turn on the students.
And questions are totally fine. Danny, you want a book before you sneak out? You're a student.
Thank you.
I'll be right back.
Yeah.
So, number one, how do we address non-binary and transgender folks?
Yes.
And number two, why are you here? Is this an NPT?
Okay. Two questions. So the first question is, we do not know. We have not done research on it. There hasn't. We want to address that?
No, do you mind just repeating the question?
Oh, the question is what's the implications for non-binary, gender fluidity? People who present in many different ways. We don't know the answer to we don't have any research on it. I can guess, but I was actually asked this question yesterday, and I slept on it last night. Say, what's a better answer than we just don't know? And on the one hand, I would argue, well, how people react to others in terms of how they present themselves. But the thing about non-binary is that it's not about this one or the other. So we just don't know. We haven't done the research on it.
And maybe this is can be a component to that, but does the expression of femininity and masculinity change how you're perceived as a person. I'm an entrepreneur, so when I walk into a room, there are certain things and practices that I bring with me that to formulate a more masculine expression because I'm treated differently in that instance. So I'm curious, is that implicated?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're taking one research in one area and applying it to another. So, there's the expression of femininity and masculinity is always compared with the way you're encoded. So if I walk in and someone looks at me and says woman, and then I behave in a more masculine way, then it will be interpreted differently. So I don't, it's interesting, right? And so we don't know. In our first chapter, this first thing we say is, we just don't know the answers to some of these. We take a very binary approach. And I'm more hopeful that other people will take up research in this area and continue it. So hopefully in 5 years, I'll have an answer. The second question was, is this an NPT? No, it is not. Here's why. When the four of us, when we decided to write this book, we had a mission, and our mission is to change the world. And so we really want to affect organizational change. And that's what drove us to write the book. And I've spent a year, and my colleagues too, going out and giving these talks, getting books in people's hands so that you'll go back to your organizations and make a change. So that's what we're hopeful for. So it's not an NPT. Yeah.
And I'm so sorry, I have an
we got it.
instructor with
Yeah.
students.
Okay.
There are very comfortable places outside if you want to chat with our speaker. There's also food you can take. We're going to take it out on a cart.